Well, I think we'll begin. I've been given an indication that nearly everybody's joined us. Is that right? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so my name is Dexter Galvin. I run the supply chain program at CDP. We have a fantastic panel for you this morning. We're going to go into more detail on the panel discussion in a moment, but I'm just going to take a very brief moment to give you a bit of background to CDP's supply chain work, and then I'll talk to you about the context of our discussion today, and then we'll introduce our fantastic panel. I'm sure you're all enjoying the day. This SEDEX event is always a fantastic event, and always very engaged audiences, if I remember correctly. So I'm looking forward to lots of questions from everybody. So CDP's supply chain program, we now work with over 90 major global corporations and governments to engage their supply chains on carbon, climate change, and increasingly on water. Some of those companies are Walmart, for example, the US federal government, and a large number of other European and American primarily companies. And we're delighted to be joined on the stage as well by one of our member companies in Sky. Last year, we reached out to 4,000 companies on carbon and climate change, and of those 4,000 that responded to our request, we had $6.6 billion of savings reported as a result of their efforts on carbon emissions. So we're really excited. I think there's a huge opportunity in this space, and I'm really excited about getting into this topic this morning with the panel. So this is a masterclass session. So I think the idea of a masterclass is that you guys are supposed to ask an awful lot of questions. So we're going to talk very briefly for 3 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. And I heard somebody, as they arrived in, say that the seats were incredibly comfortable, and that's no excuse to ask questions. So with this masterclass, just imagine that you're in a very badly funded school, and there's an awful lot of you in the class, and the only way to avoid detention is by asking a huge amount of questions. Okay, so the esteemed panel today, we've got Laura from Sky, we've got Jonathon from IAG, which is the major airline organization, and we've got Aleyn from the Carbon Trust. And SEDEX have brilliantly assembled these group of experts who will give us very different perspectives from different stages in the process. So I'm really excited to hand over, first of all, to Laura, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what Sky are doing in this space and how Sky are working with their suppliers. And then we'll go on through the panel.
Thank you very much. I've got to remember that I'm not in a karaoke booth right now with this lovely red microphone by me. But yes, so my name's Laura Steele, and I work for Sky in the bigger picture team. And that's basically our approach to being a responsible business and to inspire action on climate change. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Sky, we are Europe's leading broadcaster, and we have a number of, we have actually over 21 million customers, and offer a broad content range and have a number of, allow our customers to experience TV in a better way. So have a really specific set of products and services to do that. So my role within all that is to manage the implementation and strategy of across the group, so across all the 5 countries that we are present in, our environment strategy and also our supply chain strategy. So firstly, on the environment strategy side, we were the first media company to go carbon neutral back in 2006. And we're really passionate about maintaining and holding a leadership position on environmental change. And since that time, we've had a number of targets and been monitoring and measuring our carbon impact. Currently, our targets and commitments are centered around fewer, better, bigger. So that's fewer impacts as a business, having better, more sustainable products, and also having a bigger reach, so inspiring more action on climate change. And I think we're pretty proud of maintaining that leadership position since then. And to give you an example, we've been on the CDP Performance Leadership Index a number of years, and also the Carbon Trust Standard recertification. I chose those two specifically because I know who's on the panel with me. I think we all recognise the importance of measuring our own footprint, but I think what we also recognise now is that the importance of actually looking beyond your own operational impacts. So that's a nice little segue for me to talk about our supply chain strategy. So specifically in terms of carbon management, every year we complete an assessment with TrueCost, who are experts in a data assessment. And basically we give them our expenditure data across all of our suppliers, and they analyse that in terms of where the greatest spend is and what industry those suppliers fall into. And they are able to generate across all those suppliers where our carbon impact is the greatest. And typically you expect to find kind of 80-20 rule, so 80% of your emissions are in 20% of your suppliers. For us, it's actually a bit higher than that, so it's more like 90-10. And we choose to target more than that, but we choose to do the top 50 most carbon intensive suppliers, and every year ask them to engage with us via CDP supply chain. So that's, just to give you a flavour of sort of things we do. We also find it's, really important to collaborate with our suppliers, and think that helps to induce change and also increase efficiencies. So, for example, we brought our product design in-house, and that enabled us to work very much more closely with our suppliers and to help to, rationalise the components down, to think about how we're actually generating and making those products. And over the time, we've seen that our measurement of carbon across both operation and our supply chain has grown and improved. And now we're able to actually look beyond just carbon and look at our social and ethical risks and opportunities, which is why we also have members of SEDEX. But I will stop there because I know the scope of today is just carbon. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I'm going to hand over to Jonathon now. Jonathon, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm Jonathon Counsell, Group Head of Sustainability at IAG. And I guess many of you probably don't know who IAG are because we're a relatively new company, so I'll just spend 60 seconds talking about them. So it's International Airlines Group. We were set up in 2011 following the merger of British Airways and Iberia. We now have two other carriers in the group, Vueling, which is a low-cost carrier in Spain, sort of the EasyJet equivalent in Spain, and just recently we acquired Aer Lingus last August. So we're 23 billion euro turnover company. We have 530 planes. We have 60,000 employees who are one of the largest airline groups in Europe. And last week we just announced our 2015 profits, which are very strong. In fact, we're in a very unique group of airlines. We're actually creating shareholder value, and literally there are less than 5 airlines in the world that do that. So we're on a good track there. So that's IAG. Let me talk about, so climate change is very much a strategic issue for the aviation industry. We emit a lot of carbon dioxide, 2% of global emissions, which doesn't sound a lot, but that's 700 million tons a year. And we recognise that unless we address this issue, we will not be able to grow. So we talk about addressing climate change as earning our licence to grow, which is why back in 2009 we established some industry targets around reducing our CO2. So 3 targets. It's 1.5% improvement in our annual efficiency through to 2020, but more importantly, from 2020 we're going to cap our global emissions and then start a downward trajectory to a 50% reduction in our net emissions by 2050. And I say they are agreed globally by airlines, manufacturers, airports and traffic control authorities. And I think we are pretty unique. I don't know any other industry that has globally committed targets on carbon reduction. And we also now have a strategy in terms of understanding how we'll deliver to those targets. And as you can imagine, lots of focus on what we call carbon neutral growth from 2020. And in fact, 2016 is a critical year for us because we are looking to agree a mandatory offset scheme for the entire industry, so a global mandatory offset scheme through our UN body, ICAO, this October, and that will enable us fundamentally to meet that cap in emissions from 2020. And as I guess later on in the panel we'll talk about some of the other things we're doing operational efficiencies, next generation of new aircraft, and also importantly, sustainable alternative fuels equally will play a key role in helping us meet that 50% reduction by 2050. And as Laura mentioned, collaboration is the absolute key. I probably spend 3/4 of my time working with our industry partners, be it other airlines, manufacturers, Boeing, Airbus, Rolls-Royce, air traffic control authorities and airports, because basically we can't achieve anything without working with our industry partners.
Thank you very much. Industry collaboration clearly key there. Aleyn, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Aleyn Smith-Gillespie. I work with the Carbon Trust, and I oversee much of the work that we do in supply chain. The Carbon Trust was created back in 2001, and since then we've been working with UK and international businesses to help them drive carbon reductions and improve resource efficiency across both their operations, but their value chains as a whole as well. And supply chain is a key theme, and one that we've seen come really to the fore in the last few years, where companies have gone beyond now, especially those that are a bit further along the way, looking at their own operational carbon and resource efficiency, to looking at what they can do in the supply chain. And one of the things that we've seen is a challenge for companies to comprehensively address carbon and energy in the supply chain is to formulate and communicate a tangible and compelling business case for doing so. Other than, of course, a strong moral case of trying to work towards a 2 degree or a less than 2 degree world, which initiatives like science-based targets now is picking up, there is an overwhelmingly strong business case that we've seen. And this goes, of course, beyond just energy and carbon, but also around resources. But even just sticking to energy and carbon, although we've seen a plunge in resource costs in the last year and a half or so, in terms of energy costs, they have actually kept on going up, particularly in the UK, but across OECD countries as well. So if we actually look back from, say, 10 years ago, the cost of energy to end users, to business end users, has effectively broadly doubled across electricity and gas, and it hasn't actually fallen. So a lot of drivers behind that, of course, not just the commodity costs, which fluctuate behind that, but of course, regulatory costs and policy implications of trying to decarbonize our countries, and that's going to keep up the pressure. So the ultimate cost, carbon-related costs, which are ultimately energy costs, but also policy and regulatory costs, are still going to be putting upward pressure on that. And the other thing that we see is that supply chains are actually a big multiplier of cost and risk implications for companies. So for manufacturing companies, say, it can be between 10 or up to 100 times more energy and carbon emitted in the supply chain compared to a company's own operations, and that's allocated to what they procure. That doesn't include all the broader things that suppliers sell to other companies, but simply allocated to what they procure. So a huge amount of upstream carbon and energy, which means cost as well. When we overlay the trend of increasing costs and we say, okay, well, if we carry on and say roughly a 10% increase of costs going forward in a year, that equates for a FTSE 100 company, it could be up to 400 million of extra costs in the supply chain per pound procured. So a huge amount of cost. Of course, that at some point some of it will filter down to the ultimate buyer. So as companies that buy things, that's really important. The flip side, of course, is that there's an opportunity. And when we work with companies, we often see between 20 to 40% feasible energy reductions in companies and in suppliers. And if you were to overlay that on, for example, a company's tier 1 suppliers, the suppliers that they have most direct contact with, if you were able to get even the lower end, 20% savings across tier 1 suppliers, that would equate to about up to 300 million of annual cost reduction. So there's a strong business case, both from a risk downside perspective, but from a positive cost saving perspective as well, and that ultimately would equate to competitiveness. And to give you an example of the kind of things that companies have done that we've worked with, there's some really interesting examples. For example, GSK. GSK in the last couple of years undertook an extensive exercise to engage with, to identify who are their the sort of strategic suppliers and the ones that are driving carbon in the supply chain, to assess their appetite for collaboration, and then to set up a collaborative platform to both exchange knowledge between suppliers, but also to drive data gathering, further understanding of energy efficiency opportunities, and then ultimately to drive implementation. And I think that's a really interesting example of engagement, because engagement is actually quite a broad term. When you say supplier engagement, it can go from, let's say, communicating policy and intentions and expectations, which is very important, all the way through to down the spectrum of tight collaboration and innovation. And that kind of broadly, in our mind, translates into two areas of action that companies can take. One is looking actually at working with the supply chain and with the suppliers, whether it's supply chain optimization, supplier development, supplier incentives, but also what you actually make and what you produce and what you sell is really key. As Laura was saying earlier on, sustainable products. So actually by how you design your products and services, you either bake in or take out risk in your supply chain inherently. If you look at your materials, you use less, you switch them to alternative materials, or you rethink how you deliver value. That in itself, without even having to engage with suppliers, can have a massive impact on supply chain. So I'll leave it at that. Pass over to Dexter.
Great. Thank you very much, panel, for your introductions. So the panel discussion was rather ambitiously called Simplifying Carbon Management in the Supply Chain. And we're going to probe for examples of how we can best engage companies. But I think already what's emerging is a theme around collaboration. And I want to bring it back to one of the reasons that I'm here on the stage is because CDP and SEDEX are beginning a collaboration on carbon management in the supply chain. And so we're looking forward to launching that collaboration soon. And it's a very timely announcement because in the wake of the Paris Agreement, which we as CDP were very heavily involved in, we are going to see a raft of new regulation coming through. And Aleyn mentioned cost in the supply chain. I think this regulation, if your suppliers are not prepared for this sort of regulation, you're going to have significant unforeseen costs emerge in your supply chains. It's a great opportunity for the world. It gives us a compass, but now each of the regional economies are going to have to start implementing regulation to meet those targets. So I'm going to ask the panel a series of questions now, but I would like for you to start thinking about what you would like to ask the panel as well. I'm going to start with you, Laura, and you've talked about the work that you're doing with suppliers. Why are you doing it? I mean, what's the end goal of this engagement with suppliers? Is there a business case?
Well, there certainly is. I think, in terms of the end goal, I think first and foremost, it's about sharing best practice to really, it's about being on a journey and trying to reach and use your influence to inspire others and to do the right thing. And we've seen across what we've done that it comes in all shapes and sizes. So it can be sometimes data driven or report. It can also be where we feel there's a material impact of concern or a key area we do a deep delve on. So for example, we look at our product life cycle. So we look across, do a life cycle assessment across all of our key products to really understand where the biggest impact on climate change happens in that process, across from cradle to grave. And, it's important that you ask me what's the end goal, to really think about how can you achieve and share what your end goal is to reduce carbon emissions at the very start. How can you get that message across and get that understanding? So it's about being on a journey, really.
Okay, so targeted engagement and working with the right organizations. Jonathon, I mean, for you guys, obviously the largest part of your carbon footprint is your own operations. So is it a priority for you to engage with your supply chain on this? Do you find at the other side of things that your customers are asking you for this sort of information?
Absolutely, you're right that, 99% of our emissions come from flying. Our flying activity, no surprise, our buildings actually represent less than 1%. But no, the only way we can address those emissions is by working collaboratively with our partners. So, give you an example, here in the UK, we set up a group called Sustainable Aviation back in 2005. We have 40 members, and it includes all the major airlines, the manufacturers, the airports, and NATS, our Air Traffic Control Authority. And basically, most of the work we do in the UK to reduce our carbon emissions is done in collaboration with that group. The first thing we did is we prepared a carbon roadmap. And I guess there's this very strong link there with carbon measurement. You can't do roadmaps unless you have robust carbon measurement, and we have that in the aviation industry. So that 2008, we've updated it 3 times, and it basically describes how we think we can meet the peak in emissions by 2020, importantly the 50% reduction by 2050. That took, first time around, it took almost 2 years to produce that. If you're interested, if you Google sustainable aviation, you can get the 90-page report that really outlines how we think we can achieve that. But success for me is that roadmap is now so credible that the aviation minister, Robert Goodwill, now uses that carbon roadmap in his own presentation. So he uses the industry roadmap in terms of almost the government official position on what aviation will do on its emissions. And just to give you an example of the sorts of things that we work collaboratively on, so I'll talk about what we call continuous descent approaches. So I guess most of you have flown when and your final approach to an airport. A traditional approach would be the aircraft will come down and then it'll level out for a given period, then it'll descend a bit more, then it'll level out. That's a traditional approach, we call it dive and drive. Every time you level out, you have to increase the engine thrust, you're burning additional fuel, you're creating CO2. So what we've tried to pioneer here in the UK is what we call a continuous descent approach, where you just bring the aircraft in at very low throttle settings. You don't increase the engine thrust at all, and so therefore it has a double benefit. It reduces your CO2 burn, but it also reduces your noise. And to give you an example, for a wide-body aircraft like a 747, every time you do that, you can save up to a ton of carbon dioxide. At Heathrow alone, we have over 250,000 landings a year. 80% of those are on continuous descent approaches, and then definitely in the UK, we've been pioneers of that specific initiative. And it's basically airlines, air traffic control authorities, and airports in collaboration that makes that happen. So I see that's quite a good example of how we work in collaboration to reduce our CO2.
Yeah, I think that sort of collaboration leads to a sort of industry standards and standardization, which in turn simplifies the whole process for your industry. That's really great, thank you. And Aleyn, I wanted from a broader perspective to just look at cost. You talked about cost saving from this sort of work. Can you give any good examples of cost saving from working with suppliers?
Yes. So, as I mentioned earlier on, when we've worked with companies, we see quite chunky savings are feasible. I think one of the challenges then is actually after you've identified these potential savings, how do you go ahead and try to capture those and address those? One of some sort of interesting examples that companies are doing, one in particular where we worked with is with Tesco on the collaborative procurement initiative. So that's actually a really interesting collaboration model where across a number of Tesco suppliers, one of the opportunities that was identified was around lighting energy efficiency. So a very, very pragmatic sort of area to address. And what Tesco did was to create basically a buying club across its suppliers so that they could together get a much better price from suppliers of LEDs, for example. And so that model actually was very successful and is one that we're hoping to be able to replicate and that a lot of other companies are looking at as well. So that's a way where a company can, and of course Tesco being a very large organization compared to some of its suppliers, can use its scale and use its convening capability to create value and to bring down costs for its suppliers, ultimately helping it mitigate perhaps or reduce future costs in its supply chain. And looking at, so there's two things we always look at when we do an initial analysis with an organization across its value chain. It's where is the carbon, where is the cost, and where can value be created? And sometimes the carbon and the cost aren't actually the same thing. Sometimes some things generate a lot of carbon and cost very little, and vice versa. So it's identifying the sweet spots, and we believe that it's essential to identify the value of taking action if the action is to be ultimately implemented. That's the heart of everything we do. So when we, for example, worked, I mentioned earlier on with GSK and helped them establish this program across hundreds of its suppliers in collaboration with 2 Degrees, who provided the online platform, that was a key driver of creating that initiative. What's the potential cost and value benefit, both to suppliers and to GSK? There always has to be a win-win. And from that, a lot of mini projects are coming out, mini initiatives, which together actually add up to some very good cost savings. And that actually, this process is something that we've now embedded into a new standard that we've come up with, the supply chain, the carbon trust standard for carbon in the supply chain, where that process of analytical assessment of opportunities for carbon reduction value, engaging with suppliers, looking at sort of the 80-20 approach and so forth is embedded into that, and setting companies then on the journey of managing carbon in the supply chain, so over a number of years. So it's something that hopefully will scale that process up. But there's a lot of value to be had for both the company buyer and also supply chains and suppliers across a number of different areas.
Can I just come back to that end goal point? And Jonathon, you mentioned around how once you've actually helped somebody to understand a certain issue, when they start to do something about it, then you really know you're getting somewhere. I think that's something that I think we can all probably equate with. For us, actually taking a step away from the product side and more thinking about our production, we are a member of the BAFTA consortium. So we've come together with the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, and actually a lot of the independent broadcasters to actually increase awareness around sustainable production. So it's encouraging everyone to look at, first and foremost, their carbon footprint for any production that's commissioned. And that really helps to actually get a sense of where some of the main impacts are, whether it's something that's so day-to-day, but something like catering, actually. Somebody is driving thousands of miles just to, it's simple switches that can be made. And we've seen a real increase in that awareness, especially when the independent broadcasters that might be commissioning a programme for Sky, actually, they're aware of it because we actually make it a prerequisite in any of our commission programmes that they must actually look at their carbon footprint. They then go to the likes of other broadcasters and have that understanding. So then they will take the learnings from that and use that elsewhere. And that's when you really start to feel like you can make a difference and that understanding is increased.
I agree, actually. I think there's a massive shift in industry group engagement on these sort of topics over the last number of years. I used to think when I talked to an industry group of any industry that it was an excuse for the lowest common denominator of performance in that industry. And we would always try and push individual players in an industry, and they would refer back to their industry group and say, no, we can only move as fast as our industry group is going. But actually, we're finding more and more industry groups coming on board, starting to engage their suppliers through our programs. And I think there's a clear momentum from Sky and from the aviation industry as well, and from what you're seeing in retail, Aleyn, around proper industry collaboration that's actually moving the bar and moving things forward. So that's really exciting, actually. One of the things that we're going to do over the next year to push this issue forward at CDP is to start rating all responding companies to CDP on how they engage their suppliers on carbon and climate change. So that's going to be a big ranking that we're going to launch next January. And if you want further information on that, it's in our latest report that's on our website. So what I'm going to do now is open it up to the floor. Remember, you're in the masterclass, and this is the opportunity to get as much information as you want from our great panel. If you don't ask any questions, you won't get out of here. Okay, we've got Louise in the middle here. So can we get a microphone down here? And then we'll take your question up there on the left afterwards.
So I'm really interested in the simplifying of carbon management, having been on a few carbon management courses. So the questionnaire, how is it going to make it really simple for us to roll out down the supply chain?
So I'm assuming you're asking about the collaboration between CDP and SEDEX. Okay, well, the CDP questionnaire is quite a detailed questionnaire, as you might know, and it's not appropriate necessarily for all organizations, particularly the longer tail of suppliers. So organizations like Sky, when they look at their supply chain, they'll identify some key suppliers that they want to have a deeper dive on carbon and climate change, and they'll get them to respond to the full detailed CDP questionnaire. Now, for all of the other suppliers, we believe that there's an opportunity to use the vast scale of the SEDEX system to get them to start disclosing their scope 1 and 2 information. So that's direct and indirect emissions, right? It's pretty much the basic requirement out there in the marketplace at the moment, and will be what regulation will demand in future when we talk about mandatory reporting. So where companies have already responded to CDP, that data will be simply pushed across into the SEDEX system, and you'll be able to see that. So the suppliers essentially won't have to respond twice to the same set of questions. And that's a big issue, I think, in all of our industries, is the importance of standardization. The last thing we want is suppliers having to respond to the same essentially the same questions from lots of different sources across the world. So that will begin to be implemented in April in the SEDEX SAQ, and we're really looking forward to kicking that off.
I can just add a couple of comments there from the sort of airline industry. I mean, globally, we have this real challenge that there are very differing standards been established across the world. So every sort of country is setting its own, and region, its own set of carbon reporting standards. And that becomes very difficult for us because we're just talking apples and pears and lemons across the industry. So we are actively engaging with our industry association, IATA, the International Air Transport Association, to set a industry set of guidelines around carbon reporting, and then are looking to work with CDP and SEDEX and others to say, you know, these are the material issues for the airline industry. These are the things we think we should be reporting on, and then try and get some sort of standardization. So I think sort of, again, the theme of collaboration and working through association is key for us.
Yeah, and we're seeing on the investor side of CDP, where investors are looking for more sector-specific data. So we'll see the emergence of more sector-specific questions that are in line with the unique requirements of your own industry. Laura, did you want to come in on that?
I was just going to say that for the questionnaire is an important thing to be, a part of actually measuring and getting that information on the supplier, but also it's important to actually try and work with that supplier to connect up some different areas of work. So, for example, I mentioned that we do the true cost assessment, But we also have these deep dives, as I said as well. And we work across our product manufacturers to really work with them to understand where those material impacts are and how we can help them to reduce their emissions. So that's when CDP supply chain program can connect up with both our conversations we're having them with them direct face-to-face, and also the likes of the Action Exchange program through CDP, which provides a wealth of resource of contacts and additional support for those suppliers to make those reductions, whilst it also helps us to connect with them as we're working with them actually on the factory floor, trying to reduce the number of lines perhaps, improve equipment, invest in technology. So it becomes something that you can kind of connect up the pieces rather than being a distinctive questionnaire that someone's thinking, oh, I've got another questionnaire to fill in, and then something else and something else. And if you can bridge them all together, then it makes it a lot more impactful.
Yeah, I agree. Jonathon mentioned in your opening remarks, I think you mentioned the old adage, to measure is to manage. And it's absolutely true. And beyond that, though, we've seen the suppliers suggest collaborative opportunities to their customers through our system. So last year, we saw of the 4,000 suppliers that responded, we saw 3,750 odd collaborative opportunities where suppliers have actually said to their customers, hey, based on our assessment of our own organization and based on our business with you, we reckon that we can work together to reduce emissions on this particular thing. And it could be lightweighting packaging, it could be changing production lines. We had another question up here on the left. Go ahead, sir.
Hello. Oh, hi. My name's Danny Dugan. I'm the Sustainability Manager for Denmore Independent Papers. I wanted to ask the panel's views on carbon offsetting, carbon balancing, carbon capture schemes. And I also wanted to know if in supply chain analysis, it's valid to account for goods and services that are purchased as carbon offset, balanced, captured.
That's great. Offsetting, I think, is a really interesting topic for the airline industry as well. So, Jonathon, I'm going to throw that one at you in the first instance, and then perhaps we could go to Aleyn afterwards.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, so we have an intermediate goal of carbon neutral growth from 2020. That's across the entire aviation industry, so peaking our emissions. The industry went through a 5-year exercise to determine what is the most effective market-based measure to enable us to achieve that. And the solution came out as a mandatory carbon offset scheme. Now, there's a number of stakeholders that think that is not necessarily the way we should go now. It's not necessarily the most robust way to reduce your emissions. But effectively, the challenge we have, we're working across 260 members across the global industry. And some people don't even understand, the very early stages of understanding what climate change is about. So we saw it's an effective first step towards going towards, ultimately we believe that cap and trade, cap and trade emissions trading is the right way to go, but that was too big a step for us in the industry from 2020. So we'll start with a mandatory offset scheme, and now what we're working is how can we morph that into a fully fledged cap and trade scheme. But no, the thing that we recognise that it has to have environmental integrity. So there's a lot of work going on that, because there's offsets and there's offsets. So one of the things we're looking at is making sure that there is it results in a reduction in CO2 somewhere in the world. So lots of conditions and criteria around the types of offsets that you can use in the industry. Because if it's not robust and it's not driving reductions, and that's not helping anybody. So that's where we are as a sort of industry on offsetting at the moment.
Yeah, so on offsetting, I think offsetting can play a very strong role in a number of ways. From a company perspective, rather than say a whole industry perspective, it should be part of a number of things you do. So offsetting if you only rely on offsetting to reduce your carbon emissions, you obviously miss out on efficiency opportunities. You're paying out a cost, a continuous cost, rather than actually saving. But what offsetting is very useful, and it is very useful for a step, and it actually can be integral to how a company tries to internalize the cost of carbon. And carbon pricing and CDP, I think, recently did a very interesting updated study on the growth of carbon pricing and adoption of carbon pricing around companies around in the world, is a very important mechanism where you start internalizing into business decisions for investment or anything else, the cost of carbon. And as I mentioned earlier on, the cost will be increasing over time. I think we're looking at 2030 between $150 to up to $200 per ton, converging to some sort of global traded price of carbon. So internalizing that soon and getting companies into that mindset, and therefore that actually, the interesting thing is that from a procurement perspective, it gets companies thinking about the total cost of ownership of buying things, rather than just the price at the beginning. So you might be buying something cheap, but if it's energy consuming, you're going to be paying for that through energy costs and carbon pricing on an ongoing basis throughout its lifetime. So that's around the carbon pricing. On the procurement side, if I understand correctly, the question around the purchasing of goods and services is how do you account for the carbon if these goods and services have been offset that you're buying? So from a sort of standard accounting perspective, you still count the carbon. You can also report what the carbon, what's being offset. But when you do, for example, an sort of scope 3 carbon footprinting, that would still be included. You wouldn't have an offset, but you could also declare that a portion of the scope 3 has been offset through such and such a measure.
And this is going to sound pretty unusual coming from me at CDP, but I wouldn't get too hung up on specific figures for Scope 3 emissions, because there's a huge amount of double counting in there anyway. So the real value is the fact that you're engaging with the suppliers. And so if you've had that conversation with the supplier has gone so far as a result of that discussion to offset some of their emissions, at least that's a step forward, and it's a lot more valuable than, say, going to some commercial organization and coming up with a what you feel is a very robust Scope 3 figure for your supply chain emissions. Scope 3 is not an exact science, even since the GHG protocol brought in the hopeful 15 categories in recent years. So, any further questions from the floor? We've got one just here. Right now, we've got 3 people leaving the room after this.
Well, it's very comfortable here, so we might stay on a bit longer. So I'm David Stubbs. I'm an independent sustainability consultant. The question really is to Laura, and it's coming back to this simplifying thing. If I understood it right, you said that essentially you measure your carbon footprint through this, was it true cost you call it? Which is essentially using financial data to give you an overall carbon footprint. Now, if I understand it rightly, there's it's simple, but it's a bit relatively crude way of getting at your carbon footprint, because if you the correlation between financial cost and the actual carbon intensity of different goods and services isn't always that strong. And then you said also you do some very deep dives and life cycle analysis, which is the opposite scale of simplicity. That's very complex stuff to do. So first part of the question is, how good enough is the true cost approach for you? Is that something which others could do because it's a relatively simple thing? And at what point then do you decide to trigger the deep dives in full life cycle analysis?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the true cost assessment is, yes, a simple piece of work, relatively simple from our perspective to do. They're the data experts, and they have a wealth of very complicated algorithms behind them that actually interpret which industry or supplier type and how to spend. So it's not just the spend factor, it's a lot of other things, and they're much better placed to give you that specific detail on that. But it's more of a broad brush, absolutely, which is why we want to also, we think it's important to, I guess it's a bit like auditing a supplier. You don't just want to audit them. you want to also have different eyes or different perspective on stuff. Helps you to learn and understand more about what you're dealing with, which is why we also have, for areas of material concern or where there's more of a brand risk, or where we want to deep delve and look at something more in more detail, which is then when we get very much into the complicated life cycle assessment. But it can also take other forms, like a collaborative party we have with WWF. We have a partnership with them to look at other things within the supply chain, like paper and wood timber products. For us is a serious thing, because we've had a 6-year relationship with WWF on saving the Amazon rainforest. So that's another area of concern for us. So my advice would be that, if you're starting from sort of the very get-go, then have the broad brush approach. And when you start to get more familiar with that, and you will find some synergy between the suppliers that are being highlighted in the carbon intensity, more than likely with where you're finding as a business where some of your particular material impacts are. And so that's when you can have more understanding to know, right, I'm going to have a little bit more of a look in here. And if that, the life cycle assessment wasn't just suddenly there was a lot of work running up to that life cycle assessment. It's been over quite a number of years we've got to that place. Does that kind of answer your question? Does that help? Yeah. Okay.
Great. And Jonathon, could I ask that you come in on this? Because I'm interested, you know that your fuel suppliers are obviously the biggest source of emissions, because you then burn that in your own operations. Do you work with any of your other suppliers on carbon emissions? And do you actually work with fuel suppliers on any initiatives to reduce emissions?
Yeah, no, we do, and it's actually a good opportunity to talk about sustainable alternative fuels, and really it came out of the roadmap. Once we'd done a roadmap, it's amazing how much more engagement we could get with our key suppliers, because they could see the industry has a huge challenge in terms of, because we don't have many ways of mitigating our emissions, because aircraft technology is not going to change. We're going to be burning liquid fuels 2050. Our suppliers then started thinking, wait a minute. Whereas before, this is an airline problem, you produce the CO2, get on and sort it out. And they said, well, actually, if they don't sort it out, they're not going to be buying our planes or our fuel So it was a great engagement piece to say, hey, you have to work with us to help reduce our CO2. And to their credit, the Boeings and the Airbuses, they're working very hard on not just on new aircraft technology, but on alternative fuels. Now, they'll never be buying these fuels, but they recognize if they don't make airlines sustainable, we won't be buying their aircraft. But the fuel companies as well. So very engaged in create, and would essentially trying to build a new industry, i.e. renewable jet fuel, and it's challenging, and it's particularly challenging in a $30 barrel of oil world. So we have a project here in the UK where we're looking to take landfill waste and convert it into jet fuel. So take 500,000 tons of waste a year that would otherwise be buried in the ground, and turning it into 100,000 tons of jet fuel and biodiesel. And the fuel companies and the manufacturers have been instrumental in helping us progress that project, particularly with government getting the right sort of policy frameworks in place.
Do you mind if I just ask a quick question about that? Just, I heard the other day, and it might be a little bit of knowledge is a bad thing, but that you have to, you buy your fuel pretty much 2 years in advance of when you're using it. Mm-hmm. So how do you balance that with trying new fuel types? Yeah,
well, and that's absolutely right. So fuel is between 30 and 40%. Even in a low fuel cost environment today, it's between 30 and 40% of our cost base. So we manage our volatility. So we buy forward. We also hedge as well. We pay for hedging instruments, which is why, so there's been a lot of criticism of airlines. Why haven't you lowered your fuel prices with the reduction in, well, because we're still paying 2013 prices, but you will see a slight change because those hedges are beginning to unwind. But in terms of sustainable alternative fuels, these are long-term projects, and the earliest we'll be looking at is, say, 2020 in terms of supply chain. But the key for their sustainability is, one, they have to reduce our CO2, but they have to be cost competitive with today's fuel price. But when we first started looking at this in 2010, the most cost competitive alternative fuel was around $100 a barrel. It's now closer to $30 a barrel. So you can produce renewable jet fuel competitive with today's fuel price. So.
And just to bring us back to the original question, Aleyn, presumably your new standard is going to recommend pretty much the approach that Sky have been taking, which is, and indeed IAG, to identify who the most carbon-intensive suppliers are, and then to have more of a focus on those. Or
yeah, so that is the first step. Step one is this, fairly straightforward approach, which is called sort of economic input-output, using economic input-out methodology to create a hotspot picture of carbon in the supply chain. So similar to that approach, it's core to what we would do for a company, and it is broad brush. It's something you kind of do once. It doesn't make sense doing it every year because it's so crude. It's not going to reflect changes at that level of granularity. But it gives you an initial landscape of where the carbon intensity tends to be, and it's a number of overlays. It's the financial, it's the procurement information overlaid by the emission factors for different categories of product that are purchased, and there are algorithms that can help you, not just look at the carbon intensity for that category, but kind of stretch back up the supply chain. Say likely tier 1 is likely to be this amount, tier 2 and above likely this amount. So you kind of get a sense of where the carbon hotspots are and how easy they are to access in terms of, are they direct suppliers you can interface with straight away, or are they further up the supply chain? It's a first step. The next thing is that then going deep dive. The criteria for where you choose to go deep dive can be several, and it'll depend on what your priorities are. But of course, where the carbon intensity is, how easy it is to get, how strategic perhaps these suppliers are to you from a brand perspective or from other perspectives. And then you can add other things which are actually kind of very useful, which is, for example, what we did with one of our clients is to actually just go off and interview the companies. We did it on behalf of the organization we were working with, because we were sort of seen as a sort of third-party independent player, and understand what are the actual opportunities in these suppliers in terms of energy efficiency, and what's the appetite for collaboration. And the interesting thing is, through those conversations, we discovered a wealth of knowledge that suppliers had. All these ideas they're bursting with, which you mentioned, are reflected in the CDP questionnaire that they could propose to their customer. So we actually get a lot of interesting information through doing those deep dives beyond simply looking at carbon.
Great, that's fantastic. So I'm aware we have 7 minutes or thereabouts left. Do we have any further questions from the floor? Yes, we've got one here.
Hi, I'm Lorna from Blue Skies. We're a supplier of prepared fruit products. It's just a quick one, hopefully, mainly to Jonathon. We are a customer of IAG Cargo on a daily basis. When we count our carbon footprint, we count the whole plane, but as we're using passenger aircraft and flying underneath that passenger aircraft, where do the emissions sit? I guess it goes back to the double counting again, but where you're counting those emissions for the passengers, do we also count the entire plane for the cargo? And also, are you doing any work with kind of cargo customers and in the cargo area to kind of improve efficiencies and reduce emissions? Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and it is one of the challenges for the industry. And you'll be interested that IATA have a working group specifically looking at the apportionment of emissions between passenger and cargo. So they've currently created a methodology by which you can do that. So we have a mechanism by over the year, we look at our total carbon cargo carriage versus our passenger carriage, and we've come up with an industry-agreed standard in terms of how we apportion those carbon emissions. And it gets quite complicated, particularly when you if you look at an aircraft, take a 747, for instance, so it weighs 400 tons. The payload is only 60 tons, typically 40 tons passengers, 20 tons of cargo. So therefore, most of the carbon is the weight of the aircraft. So how do you apportion? So it's not actually the payload. How do you apportion the weight of that aircraft to either cargo or? But you'll be thankful that we've gone through all those debates and arguments, and you can imagine there was a bit of a difference of position between passenger airlines and cargo airlines. But we have an agreed methodology through IATA that so there's now an industry standard in how we do that.
So is there a calculation tool available on the IATA website?
Yeah, no, we can. If you sort of come and speak to me afterwards, I can put you in touch, and we can provide. There's a carbon calculator for cargo operators. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, I would imagine. No. Okay. Well, then, in that case, I'm going to ask the panel to give one point to the room to take away, to say, how can we make this better? How can you engage more effectively with your suppliers? And how can we simplify the process? I'll start with you, Laura.
Thank you. I got this memo late, but so I've been trying to just think of something as I was sitting here. I'm keeping it very simple. MCP, or My Carbon Pathway, standing for measurement, first of all, because the data is key to understand. Then with collaboration, it's very important to collaborate with others. And then also persistence. So really have that persistence and determination to get where you need to be and where you want to be, and don't give up. So my carbon pathway.
Brilliant. John?
Yeah, mine's not as succinct as that, unfortunately. But anyway, yeah, no, for us, it's, robust carbon measurement is the foundation for effective carbon management strategy. And for us, it's all about roadmaps. The key for us to work collaboratively with the industry is develop a roadmap. It's amazing how everything just links off that, and then enables you to set your targets and then drive action. And as I say, you've hit success when you've got the government actually quoting back your roadmap. So.
It's good to have the travel industry telling you that you need to know where you're going.
I guess what I would just add to what was said earlier on by Laura and Jonathon is, in addition to looking at the carbon, which is very important, is also identify where the value is as well, and try to make that part of the equation in the way you engage with the suppliers, and how you also engage with your internal stakeholders to kind of move forward these opportunities. There's a lot of savings and value to be created through these initiatives.
Great. Thank you very much to the panel. I think I've heard over the course of the hour, clarity is actually key. It's something that I've noticed. Be clear about what you're asking for, be clear about where you're going, and be clear to your suppliers about what you're asking them to do. Then collaboration very clearly, not just customer-supplier collaboration, but industry collaboration, making sure that you've got the right measurements there, and perhaps in the future looking at things like forests, deforestation and other issues. Could be supplier-to-supplier collaboration as well, and how do we catalyze that? And then standardization, absolutely critical, so that we don't have companies responding to myriad different requests for essentially the same information. So thank you to the panel. I think they deserve a great big round of applause.